The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of the Élysée Palace courtyard as President Emmanuel Macron adjusted his navy blue suit jacket. Today would mark another chapter in France's complex relationship with its former African colonies. The scheduled video conference with several African leaders was meant to discuss economic partnerships, but Macron knew the conversation would inevitably drift toward more contentious topics. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader of Burkina Faso, appeared on the large screen in the presidential conference room. At just 34 years old, Traoré had already become a symbol of Africa's new generation of leaders who refused to bow to traditional colonial powers. His khaki military uniform contrasted sharply with the ornate French decor surrounding Macron. The other African leaders on the call included representatives from Mali, Niger, and several other Sahel nations. Each face on the screen told a story of a continent in transition, caught between honoring historical ties and forging an independent future. Macron began the meeting with his characteristic confidence, speaking in measured French tones about continued cooperation and mutual benefits. He outlined France's ongoing commitment to the region through military support, economic aid, and cultural exchanges. The French president emphasized how these partnerships had maintained stability in West Africa for decades. France has always been a reliable partner to Africa, Macron stated, his hands gesturing gracefully as he spoke. We have the experience, the resources, and the commitment to help guide the region through its challenges. Our relationship is built on trust and shared history. Traoré listened quietly, his dark eyes focused intently on the screen. Behind him, the simple walls of his office in Ouagadougou stood in stark contrast to the gilded splendor of the Élysée Palace. When Macron finished his opening remarks, a brief silence filled the virtual meeting room. The tension was palpable even through the digital connection. Other African leaders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that Traoré represented a growing sentiment across the continent. The young captain had gained popularity not just in Burkina Faso, but throughout Africa, for his direct challenges to French influence. Traoré finally leaned forward, his voice calm but firm as he began to respond in clear French. Mr. President, with respect, the African people are tired of being told what is best for them. We appreciate France's historical role, but times have changed. Africa is changing. The French president's eyebrows raised slightly, though he maintained his diplomatic composure. This was not the first time he had faced criticism from African leaders, but Traoré's directness was particularly striking. The young captain had a reputation for speaking truth to power, regardless of the consequences. Captain Traoré, Macron replied, his tone remaining polite but carrying a subtle edge. France's commitment to Africa goes beyond mere politics. We have invested billions of euros in development projects, provided security assistance, and maintained cultural connections that benefit both our peoples. Around the virtual table, other African leaders watched the exchange with keen interest. Some nodded along with Macron's points, while others appeared more aligned with Traoré's perspective. The divide was becoming increasingly apparent across the continent, with younger generations questioning traditional partnerships, while older leaders maintained established relationships. Traoré's response came without hesitation. Investment and assistance are welcome, Mr. President, but not at the cost of our sovereignty. The African people want partners, not patrons. They want cooperation, not control. The room in Paris grew quieter as Macron processed the young leader's words. His advisors, seated around the mahogany conference table, exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of confrontation they had hoped to avoid. But it seemed inevitable, given the changing political landscape across Africa. France's relationship with its former colonies had always been complex, built on a foundation of shared language, culture, and economic ties. The CFA franc, backed by the French treasury, still served as the currency for 14 African nations. French companies maintained significant interests in African resources, from uranium mines in Douai, Niger to cocoa plantations in Ivory Coast. But voices like Traoré's were growing louder across the continent. Young Africans, educated and connected through social media, were questioning why their countries remained economically dependent on former colonial powers. They pointed to successful African nations that had charted independent paths and wondered why their own countries couldn't do the same. Macron leaned back in his leather chair, choosing his words carefully. Captain, I understand the desire for independence. France has never sought to control Africa, but rather to maintain beneficial relationships that serve both our interests. Mr. President, Traoré interrupted, his voice rising slightly with passion. When French companies extract billions of dollars worth of resources from African soil while African children lack clean water, can you honestly call that beneficial for both sides? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Other leaders on the call remained silent, but their expressions revealed the impact of Traoré's words. This was the crux of the matter, the perceived imbalance in France-Africa relations that had festered for decades. Macron's diplomatic training served him well as he maintained his composure. These are complex issues that require nuanced solutions, not simplistic accusations. France's presence in Africa has prevented countless conflicts and supported democratic institutions. And yet, Traoré responded, some of the most unstable regions in Africa are precisely those where France maintains the strongest presence. Perhaps it's time to consider whether Africa might be more stable if Africans were truly in charge of African affairs. The young captain's words struck at the heart of French foreign policy in Africa. For decades, France had justified its continued involvement in African affairs as necessary for regional stability. The presence of French military bases and the frequent interventions in African conflicts were presented as evidence of France's commitment to its African partners. But critics like Traoré argued that French involvement often served French interests more than African ones. They pointed to the maintenance of friendly regimes that protected French business interests, even when those regimes were unpopular with their own people. As the virtual meeting continued, the fundamental disagreement between the two leaders became increasingly clear. Macron represented the traditional view that France and Africa were natural partners, bound together by history and mutual benefit. Traoré embodied a new African perspective that questioned these assumptions and demanded genuine equality in international relationships. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define not just the relationship between France and Burkina Faso, but the future of France's role in Africa itself. The glass towers of La Défense business district gleamed in the morning sun as executives from major French corporations gathered for an emergency meeting. The luxurious conference room on the 40th floor offered a stunning view of Paris, but the atmosphere inside was tense and focused. Catherine Moreau, CEO of Afrique Mining Consortium, one of France's largest mining companies with operations across West Africa, called the meeting to order. Around the mahogany table sat representatives from energy companies, telecommunications firms, construction giants, and agricultural exporters, all with significant investments in French-speaking Africa. Gentlemen, ladies, Moreau began, her voice crisp with authority. Captain Traoré's speech last week has created ripple effects across our African operations. We're seeing increased scrutiny of our contracts, protests at our facilities, and questions from shareholders about our long-term prospects. Pierre Lefebvre from Sahel Energy Corporation nodded gravely. Our uranium operations in Niger are facing daily demonstrations. The protesters are using Traoré's exact words, saying Africa will open its own doors to resource development. Meanwhile, 4,000 kilometers away in Ouagadougou, Traoré was meeting with his economic advisors in a modest government building. The contrast with the French corporate boardroom was striking. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers, just functional furniture and walls decorated with maps of Burkina Faso. Dr. Fatou Diallo, Traoré's chief economist and a graduate of both the University of Dakar and Oxford, spread financial documents across the conference table. Captain, the numbers tell a story that supports your position. Last year, French companies extracted approximately 2 billion euros worth of gold from Burkina Faso. We received less than 100 million in taxes and royalties. Traoré studied the figures carefully. Unlike many military leaders, he had made education a priority, spending hours each day reading economic reports and policy papers. What about employment? How many Burkinabés actually benefit from these operations? The mining operations employ about 8,000 locals directly, but most are in low-skilled positions. The technical and management roles are largely filled by French expatriates, Dr. Diallo replied. Meanwhile, our agricultural sector, which employs 60% of our population, receives minimal investment. Back in Paris, Macron was reviewing similar reports with his economic team. The stakes were enormous. French companies generated over 50 billion euros annually from African operations, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs in France, and contributing significantly to the country's trade balance. Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire pulled up charts on his laptop. Mr. President, if this movement spreads beyond Burkina Faso, we could see a systematic review of French business arrangements across the Sahel. Mali and Niger are already showing signs of similar sentiment. Macron leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. What are our contingency plans if these governments begin renegotiating contracts or nationalizing operations? Limited options, Le Maire admitted. We could impose economic sanctions, but that would likely backfire by validating claims that we're trying to control African economies. Military intervention is politically impossible and would confirm every criticism Traoré has made. The French president understood the dilemma. The old tools of influence, economic pressure, and military threats were becoming counterproductive in an era when African leaders could appeal directly to their populations through social media and gain support from alternative international partners. In Ouagadougou, Traoré was exploring exactly those alternatives. His meeting with Chinese Ambassador Liu Wei had been cordial and productive. China offered infrastructure development with fewer political conditions attached, though Traoré was careful not to simply trade one form of dependence for another. Captain, Ambassador Liu said in accented French, China's Belt and Road Initiative could bring significant investment to Burkina Faso. Roads, railways, telecommunications infrastructure, all areas where we have expertise and competitive financing. Traoré nodded politely but kept his expression neutral. Ambassador, we appreciate China's interest in African development. Our principle is simple. We welcome all partners who respect our sovereignty and offer genuine mutual benefit. The Chinese diplomat smiled, understanding the implicit message. Unlike France, China had no colonial history in Africa, which made it an attractive alternative for leaders seeking to diversify their international relationships. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American officials were also paying attention to the growing France-Africa tensions. In Washington, D.C., Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Jennifer Morrison briefed Secretary of State Antony Blinken on the situation. Sir, Traoré's challenge to French influence creates opportunities for American engagement in West Africa, Morrison explained, reviewing intelligence reports. These countries possess significant mineral resources and growing consumer markets. But Traoré was determined to avoid simply replacing French influence with another form of foreign domination. His vision was more complex, leveraging Africa's resources and strategic position to build genuine partnerships with multiple countries while maintaining political independence. This approach was already showing results. At the next African Union summit in Addis Ababa, Traoré found himself surrounded by younger African leaders eager to learn from his example. President Julius Maada Bio of Sierra Leone, President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana, and several others engaged him in private conversations about reducing colonial-era dependencies. Captain, President Bio confided during a coffee break, your speech has started conversations in my country about our relationship with Britain. The people are asking why. Sierra Leone's diamonds benefit London more than Freetown. The movement was spreading beyond just France-Africa relations to encompass broader questions about post-colonial economic arrangements across the continent. This worried established powers but excited African populations, who felt their leaders were finally articulating their frustrations. Back in France, corporate executives were pressuring the government for action. Catherine Moreau from Afrique Mining Consortium requested a private meeting with President Macron. Mr. President, she said in the Élysée Palace office, Our African operations employ 25,000 French citizens and support entire regions of our economy. If we lose privileged access to African markets, the impact on France will be severe. Macron understood the economic reality, but also recognized the political constraints. Catherine, the old methods of maintaining influence are no longer viable. We need a new approach that acknowledges African aspirations while protecting French interests. The challenge was finding this balance. French officials began drafting proposals for renewed partnerships that would offer African countries greater revenue shares and more local employment in exchange for continued access to resources and markets. However, Traoré's team was skeptical of cosmetic changes that maintained fundamental power imbalances. Dr. Diallo advised caution when French officials requested new negotiations. "Captain, we must be careful not to accept marginal improvements that prevent real transformation," she warned. "The French will offer just enough change to quiet criticism while preserving their essential advantages." As the standoff continued, both sides recognized that they were engaged in something larger than a bilateral dispute. The confrontation between Macron and Traoré had become a symbol of the broader struggle between old colonial powers and new African leadership, determined to chart independent courses. The next phase would determine whether Africa could indeed open its own doors or whether established powers would find new ways to maintain their traditional keys to African resources and markets. 3 weeks after the tense video conference, the streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with unusual energy. Word had spread quickly through social media and local radio stations that Captain Traoré would be giving a major speech at the National Stadium. Young people, market vendors, students, and workers all made their way toward the venue, curious about what their leader might say. Amina Sankara, a 25-year-old economics student at the University of Ouagadougou, walked with her friends through the dusty streets. Her grandmother had lived through the colonial period, her parents through independence, and now she was witnessing what felt like a new chapter in Burkina Faso's story. "Do you think he will really challenge the French?" asked her friend Moussa, adjusting his backpack as they joined the growing crowd heading toward the stadium. Amina shrugged, but her eyes held excitement. "My professor says the CFA franc keeps us dependent on France. Maybe it's time someone finally said it out loud." Meanwhile, in Paris, Macron was receiving updates from his African affairs advisor Marie Dubois. She had spent 20 years working on France-Africa relations and understood the delicate balance required to maintain French influence while respecting African sovereignty. "Mr. President, our embassy in Ouagadougou reports that this rally could draw over 50,000 people," she said, reviewing her tablet. "Traoré's popularity has grown significantly since your last conversation." Macron stood by the window of his office, looking out at the manicured gardens of the Élysée Palace. "What are our options if he continues this confrontational approach?" "Diplomatically, we maintain our position that France supports African development and democracy," Dubois replied. "Economically, we could review our aid packages and investment commitments, but we must be careful not to appear punitive." The French president nodded thoughtfully. France's relationship with Africa was worth billions of euros annually to French companies. From construction contracts to mining rights, French businesses had thrived on preferential access to African markets. Any disruption to this system would have consequences far beyond diplomatic embarrassment. At the stadium in Ouagadougou, the crowd had swelled to capacity. Families sat together on metal bleachers while young people stood in the aisles, many holding small Burkina Faso flags. The atmosphere was festive but charged with anticipation. Captain Traoré appeared on stage wearing his simple military uniform, the same one he had worn during the video conference with Macron. Unlike many political rallies, there were no elaborate decorations or expensive sound systems. The simplicity seemed to resonate with the crowd, who erupted in cheers and applause. "My fellow citizens," Traoré began, his voice carrying clearly through the stadium speakers, "today I want to talk to you about doors and keys." The crowd quieted, intrigued by the metaphor. Even those watching on television across Burkina Faso and neighboring countries leaned in closer. "For too long we have been told that others hold the keys to our future, that without these keys, We cannot open the doors to prosperity, security, and dignity. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But I say to you today that Africa has always had its own doors. The stadium erupted in cheers and whistles. In the VIP section, foreign diplomats and local officials watched intently, aware that they were witnessing something significant. Traoré raised his hand for quiet and continued. When the French president tells us that France holds the keys, he speaks from an old script, a script written when Africans were not considered capable of governing themselves, of managing their own resources, of determining their own futures. In Paris, Macron watched a live stream of the speech from his office. His advisors sat around him, taking notes and monitoring social media reactions across Africa. The hashtag #Africa has its own doors was already trending in multiple languages. This is more than just anti-French sentiment, observed Jean-Claude Martineau, France's foreign minister who had joined the viewing session. Traoré is articulating something that resonates across the continent. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré's speech was building toward its climax. Our gold, our uranium, our cotton, our land, these are African resources. Our young people, our entrepreneurs, our innovators, these are African talents. Our culture, our languages, our traditions, these are African treasures. The crowd was on its feet now, with many people wiping away tears. Amina found herself deeply moved by words that seemed to capture feelings she had carried for years, but never heard expressed so clearly. We do not reject friendship with France or any nation, Traoré continued, his tone becoming more measured. We welcome partnerships based on equality and mutual respect, but we reject any relationship that treats us as junior partners in our own continent. The captain paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what would become the most quoted line of his speech. When President Macron says France still holds the keys, I say to him and to the world, Africa has its own doors, and we will open them ourselves. The stadium exploded with the loudest cheers of the day. People hugged strangers, danced in the aisles, and chanted slogans in local languages. The speech was being translated and shared across social media platforms in real time, reaching audiences from Dakar to Nairobi. In her university dormitory that evening, Amina called her grandmother in their village outside the capital. Grandmother, did you hear the captain's speech today? The elderly woman's voice crackled through the poor phone connection. Yes, child. It reminded me of Thomas Sankara's words from long ago. But this young man, he speaks to a different time, when Africa is stronger. Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader of the 1980s, had also challenged French influence before his assassination in 1987. His legacy lived on in the minds of many Burkinabé, and Traoré's invocation of African self-reliance echoed Sankara's philosophy. Meanwhile, in French government circles, emergency meetings were being called. The speech had been covered by major international news outlets, and other African leaders were being asked for their reactions. Some supported Traoré's message, while others maintained their commitment to traditional partnerships with France. Marie Dubois worked late into the night, drafting talking points for French officials. The challenge was how to respond without appearing dismissive of legitimate African concerns, while still protecting French interests across the continent. We need to be careful, she told her team. If we react too strongly, we risk validating Traoré's narrative that France is paternalistic. If we don't respond at all, it might be seen as weakness. The French Foreign Ministry ultimately decided on a measured response, emphasizing France's respect for African sovereignty while highlighting the benefits of continued cooperation. But privately, officials acknowledged that Traoré's speech had struck a nerve that extended far beyond Burkina Faso. In the following days, student groups in Senegal organized solidarity rallies, while opposition politicians in Mali quoted Traoré's words in parliament. The doors and keys metaphor spread across social media, becoming a rallying cry for young Africans who felt their countries deserved better relationships with former colonial powers. The battle lines were being drawn for a larger confrontation about the future of France-Africa relations. with Captain Traoré emerging as an unlikely but powerful voice for African independence and dignity. The ornate halls of the Palais des Congrès in Paris buzzed with diplomatic activity as delegates from across Africa and Europe gathered for what had been hastily renamed the Partnership for the Future Summit. Originally planned as a routine, France-Africa Economic Conference, it had transformed into something far more significant following the public confrontation between Macron and Traoré. Traoré stepped off the Air France flight at Charles de Gaulle Airport, wearing his characteristic, simple military uniform rather than the formal diplomatic attire favored by other African leaders. His small delegation contrasted sharply with the large entourages accompanying presidents from countries that maintained closer ties with France. French Foreign Minister Jean-Claude Martineau greeted the Burkina Faso delegation with diplomatic courtesy, but the atmosphere was noticeably tense. Captain Traoré, welcome to Paris. President Macron looks forward to productive discussions. Minister Martineau, Traoré replied in perfect French, his tone respectful but firm. We come seeking dialogue based on mutual respect and equality. Nothing more, nothing less. The exchange was carefully watched by international media representatives, who had descended on Paris to cover what many were calling a potential turning point in France-Africa relations. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and African networks all had correspondents following every development. At the Grand Hotel where the African delegations were staying, Traoré met privately with other leaders who had been influenced by his stance. President Faustin Archange Touadéra of Central African Republic, President Mohamed Bazoum of Niger, and several opposition leaders from other francophone countries gathered in a suite overlooking the Champs-Élysées. Captain, President Bazoum said quietly, your words have resonated across our region, but we must be realistic about the consequences of challenging France too directly. They still control much of our economic infrastructure. Traoré nodded thoughtfully. President Bazoum, I understand the concerns, but consider this. Are we better served by accepting inadequate arrangements out of fear, or by demanding partnerships that truly benefit our people? The discussion continued late into the night, with leaders sharing their experiences of French pressure and their population's growing demands for change. It became clear that Traoré was not alone in his frustrations, even if others were less willing to voice them publicly. Meanwhile, President Macron was conducting his own strategy sessions with European Union leaders and African heads of state, who remained aligned with traditional partnerships. The goal was to isolate Traoré's position and demonstrate that most African countries still valued their relationships with France. President Alassane Ouattara of Ivory Coast, a longtime French ally, met with Macron in the Élysée Palace. Emmanuel, Traoré speaks for the young and the frustrated, but not for pragmatic leaders who understand the benefits of our partnership with France. Precisely, Macron agreed. We need to show that France remains Africa's most reliable partner while addressing legitimate concerns about equality in our relationships. The opening ceremony of the summit was a carefully choreographed affair designed to project unity and cooperation. Macron delivered a speech emphasizing France's commitment to African development, while acknowledging the need for evolving partnerships that respected African sovereignty. France has always been and will always be Africa's friend, Macron declared to the assembled delegates. But friendship means growth. It means evolution. It means adapting to new realities while honoring shared values. When Traoré's turn came to address the summit, the tension in the auditorium was palpable. Unlike other speakers who read from prepared texts, he spoke directly to the audience, making eye contact with delegates across the room. Distinguished colleagues, he began, we gather here not as former colonies and colonial powers, but as sovereign nations seeking mutually beneficial relationships. The question is not whether Africa needs partners. We welcome true partnership. The question is whether we will accept partnerships as equals or continue as subordinates. The young captain's words carried weight because they reflected polling data showing growing African dissatisfaction with traditional arrangements. Recent surveys indicated that over 70% of young Africans believed their countries were not receiving fair value from relationships with former colonial powers. During the coffee break, Heated discussions erupted among delegates. Some African leaders privately expressed support for Traoré's position, while others worried about jeopardizing their country's economic relationships with France. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, whose country had successfully diversified away from French influence, approached Traoré. Captain, Rwanda's experience shows that it's possible to maintain good relationships with France while asserting your independence. The key is having alternatives. This was exactly what Traoré had been working on. His economic team had been quietly negotiating with multiple partners: China for infrastructure, Turkey for agricultural development, and various European countries for trade relationships that didn't come with political conditions. The summit's working sessions revealed the depth of the divide. When French officials proposed new agreements that slightly increased African countries' shares of resource revenues, Traoré's team questioned whether cosmetic changes addressed fundamental structural problems. Dr. Fatou Diallo, representing Burkina Faso in the Economic Working Group, presented data showing how small increases in royalty payments still left African countries receiving a tiny fraction of the value extracted from their resources. Colleagues, she addressed the mixed African-European audience, increasing our share from 5% to 8% is still fundamentally unequal when we provide the resources, the land, and the labor. French business representatives in the room shifted uncomfortably. They had hoped that modest concessions would satisfy African concerns without significantly impacting their profit margins. During a private dinner hosted by Macron for African heads of state, the conversation became more personal. The French president appealed directly to his guests' concerns about stability and development. "My friends," Macron said, raising his wineglass, "France's commitment to Africa goes beyond economics. We have provided security assistance, helped maintain stability, and supported democratic institutions. These relationships have prevented countless conflicts." Traoré, who had initially declined the dinner invitation but was convinced to attend by other African leaders, responded calmly but directly. "Mr. President, with respect, some of the most unstable regions in Africa are precisely where France maintains the strongest military presence. Perhaps true stability comes from African solutions to African problems." The comment created an awkward silence around the elegant dinner table. Other guests looked down at their plates, aware that Traoré had raised questions that many African leaders discussed privately but rarely voiced in such settings. President Macky Sall of Senegal attempted to lighten the mood. "Captain, surely we can find common ground between maintaining beneficial relationships and asserting our sovereignty." "Absolutely, President Sall," Traoré replied. "Common ground exists when relationships are truly mutual, when African countries have the freedom to choose their partners based on national interest rather than historical obligations." As the dinner concluded, it was clear that the summit had not resolved the fundamental tensions in France-Africa relations. If anything, it had highlighted how deep the divide had become between traditional approaches and the new African nationalism represented by leaders like Traoré. The final day of the summit would determine whether diplomacy could bridge these differences or whether the confrontation would escalate into a broader challenge to the entire system of post-colonial economic relationships. The final morning of the Paris summit arrived with gray skies that seemed to mirror the uncertain mood among delegates. Traoré sat in his hotel room, reviewing notes while watching BBC World News report on protests that had erupted across several African capitals in support of his position. In Bamako, Mali, thousands of young people had gathered outside the French embassy chanting, "Africa has its own doors." In Niamey, Niger, university students organized solidarity demonstrations, while in Dakar, Senegal, civil society groups called for their government to support Burkina Faso's stance. The protests worried French officials but energized African civil society organizations who saw Traoré as finally articulating their long-held frustrations. Social media campaigns using hashtags like #AfricaRising and #Sovereignty Not Dependence were trending across the continent. Marie Dubois, France's African Affairs advisor, knocked softly on President Macron's hotel suite door. "Mr. President, we have a situation developing. Intelligence reports suggest coordinated protests in at least 12 African cities, all supporting Traoré's message." Macron, already dressed in his navy suit for the final summit session, reviewed the reports with growing concern. How coordinated are we talking about? Is this spontaneous or organized? Appears to be largely spontaneous, driven by social media and local civil society groups. But the message is remarkably consistent across different countries and languages, Dubois replied. What French intelligence couldn't fully grasp was that Traoré's message had resonated precisely because it reflected genuine popular sentiment. Young Africans, educated and connected through technology, had long questioned why their resource-rich countries remained economically dependent on former colonial powers. At the same time, Traoré was meeting with a delegation of African business leaders who had traveled to Paris specifically to support his position. Aisha Nakamura, a successful Ghanaian entrepreneur who had built a Pan-African technology company, spoke passionately about the need for economic independence. "Captain, what you're saying isn't radical, it's common sense," she said, surrounded by other African executives in the hotel conference room. "We have the resources, the human capital, and increasingly the technology to control our own economic destiny." Marcus Okello, a Kenyan mining engineer who had worked across the continent, added his perspective. "The technical expertise that French companies claim to provide, we have those skills in Africa now. What we lack is access to capital and markets, which comes from political arrangements, not technical capacity." These conversations strengthened Traoré's resolve as he prepared for the summit's crucial final session. He understood that he was representing not just Burkina Faso, but a generation of Africans who refused to accept that their countries were destined for permanent subordination. The final plenary session took place in the grand auditorium of the Palais des Congrès. Every seat was filled, with journalists, diplomats, and civil society representatives watching intently. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. President Macron took the podium first, delivering what his advisors had crafted as a conciliatory but firm response to the week's tensions. "Ladies and gentlemen, France's relationship with Africa is not about keys and doors, but about bridges of cooperation, mutual respect, and shared prosperity." The French president outlined new proposals: increased African participation in French companies' African operations, higher royalty payments for resource extraction, and expanded scholarships for African students in French universities. These measures demonstrate France's commitment to evolving our partnerships while maintaining the bonds that have benefited both our peoples for generations, Macron concluded to polite applause from the audience. When Traoré approached the podium, the auditorium fell completely silent. Even those who disagreed with his positions recognized that his response would be historically significant. "Thank you, President Macron, for your proposals," Traoré began, his voice calm but carrying easily through the hall. "They represent progress, and progress should always be acknowledged. However, they also illustrate the fundamental difference in our perspectives." He paused, looking directly at the French delegation before continuing. "You speak of bridges, but bridges connect equal shores. What has existed between France and Africa has not been a bridge, but a ladder, with France at the top and Africa at the bottom." Murmurs rippled through the audience as Traoré continued his measured but devastating critique. "The proposals you offer today, increasing our share from 5% to 10%, from 10% to 15%, still assume that others determine our portion. True partnership means Africa sets the terms for African resources." The young captain's words were being broadcast live across Africa, where millions gathered around television sets and mobile phones to hear what many considered the most important speech by an African leader in decades. "We do not